In the middle of the 18th century, one man walked through the streets of London, carrying an object so shocking that complete strangers yelled abuse from across the road. Coach drivers hurled rotting rubbish at him. One furious driver even tried to knock him down with a horse-drawn carriage. His offense wasn't treason, it wasn't blasphemy, he wasn't breaking any law, he was simply walking with an umbrella. Today, that sounds almost impossible to believe. An umbrella is one of the most ordinary objects you can own, especially in Britain, where rain is practically part of everyday life. Yet, there was a time when carrying one could make you the target of ridicule, violence, and public humiliation. Even more astonishing, just 100 years later, everything had changed. By the middle of the 19th century, umbrellas had become an unmistakable symbol of the English gentleman. Bankers carried them, lawyers carried them, office clerks carried them. A walk through London without one almost seemed incomplete. So how did an object once mocked as disgraceful become one of Britain's most recognizable accessories in the space of a single century? The answer stretches across more than 3,500 years of history. It begins beside the Nile River with Egyptian pharaohs, passes through the courts of Chinese emperors and the fashion houses of Europe, collides with furious London coach drivers, and centers on one remarkably stubborn man who refused to abandon an idea everyone else thought was ridiculous. To understand why an umbrella could spark so much outrage, we have to travel back to where its story first began. More than 3,500 years ago, under the relentless sun of ancient Egypt, artists painted scenes inside royal tombs that still survive today. Those paintings show servants holding large parasols made from palm leaves and elegant ostrich feathers above the heads of pharaohs and deities as they moved through the blazing desert landscape. These early creations had nothing to do with rain. In fact, the very word umbrella traces its roots to the Latin word umbra, meaning shadow or shade. Their original purpose was simply to protect people from the scorching sun. And not just any people. In ancient Egyptian society, parasols were reserved almost exclusively for royalty and the divine. Massive canopies crafted from papyrus, feathers, and other luxurious materials were carried by attendants whose sole job was to shield rulers from the African heat. If someone walked beneath one of these canopies, there was no question about their place in society. The parasol wasn't merely practical, it was a public declaration of power. Long before a king ever spoke, the shade above his head announced his authority. The same symbolism appeared elsewhere in the ancient world. Across Mesopotamia, carved reliefs from the Assyrian Empire depict servants holding parasols over kings during military marches and sacred ceremonies. The privilege belonged to the ruler alone. Everyone else remained exposed beneath the unforgiving sun. Shade itself had become a symbol of rank. Then, thousands of miles to the east, another civilization transformed the idea forever. Around 1100 BC, Chinese craftsmen introduced a breakthrough no other known culture had achieved. They made the parasol waterproof. By treating silk and later specially prepared paper with protective coatings of wax and lacquer, they created the world's first true umbrellas, capable of shielding people from both blazing sunlight and falling rain. But that wasn't their only innovation. Chinese engineers also developed early folding mechanisms, allowing umbrellas to collapse and open with remarkable convenience. Incredibly, people in China were using collapsible umbrellas more than 2,000 years before much of the rest of the world would adopt anything similar. Like the royal parasols of Egypt, however, these inventions were symbols of prestige before they were everyday tools. The Chinese emperor was traditionally accompanied beneath an elaborate four-tiered umbrella, while neighboring rulers in Siam displayed even grander versions with as many as 24 layers. Every additional tier represented greater authority and higher status. The umbrella wasn't simply protection from the weather, it became a portable throne, a visible reminder that power could travel wherever its owner went. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and other ancient civilizations, one message remained remarkably consistent. An umbrella wasn't an everyday necessity. It represented privilege, it represented status, and in many cases, it represented divine authority itself. For thousands of years, that meaning hardly changed. But when this remarkable object finally reached Europe, something unexpected happened. Instead of preserving its ancient identity as a symbol of kings and rulers, the umbrella took on an entirely different reputation, one that would eventually make a simple walk through London's streets far more controversial than anyone could have imagined. When the umbrella finally made its way into Europe, it carried thousands of years of history behind it, but almost none of its original meaning survived. The ancient Greeks first encountered parasols through their contact with Egypt, and the Romans later embraced the idea as well. Yet, they didn't adopt it in quite the same way. In Rome, the parasol gradually became associated almost entirely with women. Wealthy Roman women carried beautifully decorated parasols to protect their complexions from the Mediterranean sun. Some historical records from the 1st century even describe women coating paper parasols with oil so they could repel rain as well as sunlight. The important detail, however, wasn't how they used them, it was who used them. Roman men generally didn't carry parasols. Doing so was viewed as feminine, and that perception lingered long after the Roman Empire itself disappeared. For roughly the next 1,000 years, umbrellas almost vanished from everyday European life. Throughout the Middle Ages, people relied on thick wool cloaks, hooded garments, and wide-brimmed hats whenever bad weather arrived. Carrying an umbrella simply wasn't part of European culture anymore. The concept faded into the background, surviving only in scattered references rather than common practice. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that parasols began making a comeback. They first reappeared in countries such as Italy and France, where they became fashionable accessories among wealthy women. Rather than serving as practical rain gear, they were elegant symbols of refinement, designed to preserve pale skin and complete an aristocratic appearance. England soon followed the trend. By the early 1700s, it was perfectly respectable for an English lady to stroll through public streets carrying a silk parasol. In fact, it was considered a mark of sophistication and good taste. But notice one crucial detail: a lady carried a parasol, not a gentleman. By the time umbrellas reached England, they arrived burdened with centuries of cultural assumptions. They were linked to women. They were linked to French fashion. And in 18th century England, those two associations combined into something many Englishmen wanted absolutely nothing to do with. That distinction explains almost everything that happened afterward. Britain wasn't simply a nation famous for rain. It was also a society with a deeply rooted idea of masculinity. A respectable English gentleman wasn't expected to hide from unpleasant weather. He endured it. If rain started falling, you buttoned your coat, accepted getting soaked, and continued with your day. If the weather became unbearable, and if you had enough money, you hired a sedan chair or a horse-drawn coach to take you where you needed to go. That arrangement benefited an entire industry. Coach drivers and sedan chair carriers earned their best income during storms. Every rainy day meant more passengers and fuller pockets. Bad weather wasn't an inconvenience to them. It was good business. Then one traveller returned to London with an idea that threatened to change all of that. His name was Jonas Hanway. Born in Portsmouth in 1712, Hanway spent his teenage years as an apprentice to a merchant in Lisbon, Portugal. Eventually, he returned to London, where he established himself in the world of international trade and later became a partner in a textile business connected to St. Petersburg, Russia. But Hanway wasn't content to stay behind a desk. In 1743, at the age of 31, he embarked on an ambitious commercial expedition from Russia to Persia, modern-day Iran, with the goal of opening new silk trading routes. It turned into the journey of a lifetime. For nearly a year and a half, Hanway crossed dangerous territory under conditions that tested every ounce of his endurance. Pirates threatened his expedition. Plague spread through regions he traveled. His merchandise was seized. Disaster followed disaster, piling obstacle upon obstacle in a journey that would have convinced most people to abandon the mission almost immediately. Yet Hanway kept going. When he finally returned to England in 1750, he was 38 years old and known as someone who had experienced parts of the world few of his countrymen had ever seen. And during those travels, one everyday sight had stayed with him. In Persia, umbrellas weren't treated as unusual at all. Men carried them. Women carried them. People used them openly to shield themselves from both harsh sunlight and rain without embarrassment or social stigma. To Hanway, the idea seemed almost laughably practical. He had spent much of his life in London, one of Europe's wettest capitals, where people regularly accepted getting drenched simply because custom demanded it. Compared to that, carrying an umbrella seemed like common sense. So he brought one home, and he started using it. The reaction wasn't curiosity, it wasn't admiration, it was outrage. As Hanway walked through London's streets beneath his umbrella, people openly mocked him. Crowds laughed, pointed, and shouted insults as he passed. Some stared in disbelief, as though a grown man had decided to parade through the city wearing a ballroom dress. Many branded him a pretentious Frenchman. Others told him that if he considered himself a real gentleman, he should stop walking and pay for a coach like everyone else. The hostility came from several directions at once. First, umbrellas were still widely viewed as women's accessories, making any man who carried one appear unmanly. Second, they were strongly associated with France, England's longtime rival and, during much of the mid-18th century, effectively its enemy. And third, carrying an umbrella suggested something even more offensive to London's upper classes. It implied that a man couldn't afford a carriage. A wealthy gentleman, critics argued, wouldn't bother walking through the rain. He would simply hire someone else to transport him. That final belief would soon turn ridicule into something much more dangerous. That last accusation was the one that truly changed everything. For London's coach drivers and sedan chair carriers, Jonas Hanway wasn't just an eccentric man with unusual taste. He was a threat to their livelihoods. Rainy weather was the transport industry's biggest moneymaker. The worse the storm, the more people paid to avoid walking through soaked streets. Every downpour meant more fares, more passengers, and more income. But an umbrella changed that equation completely. If ordinary people could stay reasonably dry while walking, many would no longer need to pay for a carriage. To the men who depended on those fares, Hanway wasn't simply carrying an umbrella. He was carrying something that could eventually take money straight out of their pockets. Their response was swift. Whenever Hanway appeared, coach drivers shouted insults from their seats. They mocked him as he walked past. Some threw rotting garbage in his direction, hoping either to humiliate him or force him to abandon his strange habit. Then the hostility escalated. On at least one documented occasion, a hackney coach driver went far beyond shouting abuse. He allegedly tried to run Hanway down with his horse-drawn carriage. Hanway's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of running away, he dragged the driver from his seat and struck him with the very object that had caused the confrontation in the first place. As it turned out, an umbrella could serve as a surprisingly effective weapon. But that's not what makes Jonas Hanway's story remarkable. The extraordinary part isn't that he carried an umbrella for a few days as an experiment. It's that he refused to stop. Day after day, year after year, for 3 decades. Through endless ridicule, through flying rubbish, through attempted assaults, Jonas Hanway continued walking London's streets with an umbrella over his head as though none of the criticism mattered. Most people would have given in long before then. Hanway wasn't most people. This was a man who had already survived a brutal year-and-a-half trading expedition across dangerous territory. He had endured pirates, outbreaks of plague, the loss of valuable cargo, and countless setbacks while traveling between Russia and Persia. After experiences like those, A few angry London coach drivers simply weren't intimidating. His determination bordered on unbelievable. The 20th century scholar Charles Wilson later described Hanway as one of the most indefatigable and splendidly boring figures in English history. It was an oddly fitting description. Once Hanway became convinced he was right, changing his mind was almost impossible. The umbrella wasn't the only battle he chose to fight. In 1756, he published an essay arguing that England's growing obsession with drinking tea was harming the nation. His criticism sparked a public dispute with two of Britain's best-known literary figures, Samuel Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith. Taking on umbrellas was one thing. Taking on tea in Britain was something else entirely. Yet Hanway somehow managed to wage both campaigns at the same time. Only one of them, however, would permanently change everyday life. While the public focused on mocking the man with the umbrella, Hanway was quietly building a reputation for something far more important. He became one of the leading philanthropists of his generation. In 1756, he established the Marine Society, an organization that provided training and financial assistance to boys hoping to build careers in the merchant navy. He also served as a governor of the Foundling Hospital, which cared for orphaned and abandoned children. Another cause close to his heart was ending the cruel practice of forcing young children to work as chimney sweeps, and he campaigned tirelessly against it. By almost any measure, Hanway devoted enormous amounts of his life to improving the lives of others. Yet, despite all those accomplishments, many Londoners still recognized him first as the man carrying the umbrella. And every single day, whether the skies were clear or pouring with rain, he continued carrying it. The change he hoped to see didn't arrive overnight. There was no dramatic announcement, no single moment when public opinion suddenly flipped. Instead, it happened the way most cultural revolutions do. Slowly, quietly, one person at a time. People began noticing something impossible to ignore. Jonas Hanway stayed dry, everyone else got soaked. The same man who endured insults and had garbage thrown at him also avoided paying for expensive carriage rides. He walked comfortably through rain that left everyone around him drenched. No amount of ridicule could erase one obvious fact. The umbrella worked. Eventually, practicality began defeating pride. A few men decided to carry umbrellas themselves. That made the next person feel slightly less embarrassed about doing the same. Then another followed, and another. With every new adopter, the idea became just a little more acceptable. Historians later observed that, in the years following Hanway's example, towns throughout England often developed their own local stories about the first man brave enough to walk through the streets carrying an umbrella. In other words, nearly every community ended up with its own version of Jonas Hanway. What had started with one stubborn traveller gradually spread across the country. By the time Jonas Hanway died in September 1786 at the age of 74, umbrellas were becoming an increasingly common sight throughout England. He had lived long enough to witness the beginning of the change he had fought for over 30 years. The coach drivers who had mocked him, the critics who had called him weak, the people who insisted no respectable gentleman would ever carry an umbrella, history had quietly proved them wrong. That same year, sculptor John Francis Moore created a monument to Hanway in Westminster Abbey. The memorial wasn't built because he popularized the umbrella. It honored the decades he had devoted to philanthropy and public service. Its inscription describes him as a man whose name liveth and will ever live. Even today, his legacy survives in central London. Near Tottenham Court Road, a street still bears his family name, Hanway Street. By then, the greatest battle had already been won. Society had accepted the umbrella. Now all it needed was someone to transform it into the practical, elegant accessory that would soon become famous around the world. Once Jonas Hanway had broken the social barrier, the umbrella's next transformation came not through public opinion, but through innovation. With the stigma fading, inventors and craftsmen finally had the opportunity to improve the umbrella itself. One of the first men to seize that opportunity was James Smith. In 1830, Smith opened a modest workshop and storefront near Regent Street in London, where he specialized in manufacturing and selling high-quality umbrellas. Nearly 2 centuries later, James Smith and Sons is still in business. Located at 53 New Oxford Street, the shop is considered the oldest umbrella retailer in London, and quite possibly the oldest in all of Europe. Step inside today, and it feels like stepping back into Victorian England. The mahogany display cases, polished brass fittings, and traditional craftsmanship remain remarkably unchanged from the 19th century. Even now, umbrellas are still handmade on the premises. But while James Smith perfected the art of making umbrellas, another inventor revolutionized how they were built. That man was Samuel Fox. In 1852, the British industrialist from Stocksbridge, near Sheffield, introduced what became known as the Paragon umbrella frame. Until then, most umbrellas relied on thick wooden ribs. They worked, but they were heavy, awkward to carry, and prone to breaking. Fox replaced those wooden supports with lightweight steel ribs. The idea reportedly came from an unexpected source. As a skilled wire drawer, Fox noticed that leftover steel stays, originally manufactured for women's corsets, possessed exactly the strength and flexibility needed for umbrella frames. By reshaping those steel stays into U-shaped ribs, he created umbrellas that were lighter, stronger, and much easier to carry. The improvement was so successful that within just 6 months, the Paragon frame became the only product his company manufactured. Demand exploded. Samuel Fox and Company eventually grew into one of England's largest steel manufacturers, all because of an innovation inspired by umbrella ribs. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the umbrella had completed one of the most remarkable image transformations ever experienced by an everyday object. Less than 150 years earlier, it had been dismissed as feminine. It had been mocked as foreign. It had been ridiculed as something only a coward would carry. Now, it had become the unmistakable symbol of the English gentleman. An umbrella wasn't simply useful anymore. It was expected. Many featured elaborate custom handles that concealed surprising extras, including hip flasks and even hidden daggers. In Edwardian London, leaving home without an umbrella was almost unthinkable. It was as essential as wearing a watch. A gentleman without one looked incomplete. But history rarely stands still. Over time, the umbrella underwent one final transformation. It stopped being a treasured possession and became something disposable. Today, the global umbrella industry generates nearly $8 billion in annual revenue. Most of the world's umbrellas are manufactured in China's Guangdong, Fujian, and Zhejiang provinces, which have become the center of global umbrella production. Compact folding umbrellas alone account for more than $3 billion of that worldwide market. Ironically, they're also among the easiest everyday items to lose. Every year, over 80,000 umbrellas are left behind on the London Underground. In Japan, more than 5 million umbrellas are abandoned annually. They're forgotten on trains, left behind in restaurants, misplaced on buses, then quietly replaced with new ones. It's a strange ending for an object with such an extraordinary history. Something that once stood above Egyptian pharaohs as a symbol of divine authority. Something that represented royal power in ancient Mesopotamia. Something Chinese craftsmen transformed into the world's first true rain shield. Something that nearly got one man attacked in the streets of London has become so ordinary that millions of people barely notice when they leave one behind. If you ever find yourself walking through central London, just off Tottenham Court Road, you may pass a narrow road called Hanway Street. Most pedestrians cross it without giving the name a second thought. Only a short walk away, James Smith and Sons continues crafting handmade umbrellas inside a Victorian storefront that has changed remarkably little since the 1870s. Those two places quietly preserve the memory of a story that most people have forgotten. For 30 years, Jonas Hanway endured mockery, abuse, flying garbage, and even physical attacks simply because he believed people shouldn't have to get soaked every time it rained. He never set out to change fashion. He never intended to become a cultural icon. He simply refused to abandon an idea that made perfect sense. And because he wouldn't give up, generations of people after him came to see the umbrella as completely ordinary. The next time you instinctively open one as rain begins to fall, remember this. There was a time when that simple act could make an entire city laugh at you. Someone had to make the ordinary, ordinary. And that someone was Jonas Hanway. If you enjoyed uncovering the surprising history behind one of the world's most familiar everyday objects, there's another story just as unbelievable waiting for you in the next video. Click it now, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next hidden chapter of history.